Very cool. Really excited that you guys are here. It seems like a really interesting group, and hopefully we build some cool stuff today. So I have like probably around an hour to an hour and a half of kind of just like background of extensions, like maybe why we added that to Dynamo and how we started using them and started refactoring some of Dynamo to actually use the extensions instead of developing more core functionality. And then I'm going to just go through some of the APIs for that. And then I think the rest of the day will be kind of you building, whatever you're interested in building for the day, and we could talk about, if you didn't come ready or loaded with an idea, we can talk about different ideas, share some different ideas between people, and then I think the plan is we can kind of come around.
Yeah, so one thing that is not on this schedule, but it is on the printed out sheet, is at 5 o'clock there will be something that we do at Grimshaw every week, which is called Friday at 5. So you guys are all invited to join us. It's in the atrium at the front, and Russell and Luke will give us a kind of insight into how they work internally at Autodesk, and the rest of the office will also join us for that presentation. So feel free to join us. Luke, sorry, Mike.
Close enough.
I was thinking of
four-letter words. Right, and then we'll just get into, I figure the Autodeskers here can kind of go around and we can help you work on whatever you're working on if you're in groups or working on some kind of extension solo. So I titled this thing Superpowered Dynamo, and then with a quote from Uncle Ben from Spider-Man. I don't know if that plays here as well as in the US, but with great power comes great responsibility. Probably quoted somewhere else before that. So that's just something I'm going to try to reiterate through this content, is just that you essentially, when you're building an extension, you have kind of application level access to the APIs, which you don't have, which by design you don't have from like a zero-touch node. If I would imagine most of you are familiar with zero-touch nodes, but that's where you can import a node just using C# and or any kind of .NET compiled code. And it's kind of by design that you don't have access to some of these application level APIs, and you do in an extension. And so it's very easy or potential to write two extensions which interact with each other in ways that make the experience for people using Dynamo very bad. What if if those two extensions do very different things to the same data or something like that? So it's important to consider that and consider what people are going to install. But I'll just be going through that a couple times in different places where that'll come up. But I think it's important enough to make it the subtitle. So where extensions fit into the kind of Dynamo ecosystem of hackability or extensibility, this is actually a Luke original that I amended with the extensions bit that we added. So this graph is kind of showing the expressive power of different interactions with Dynamo that you can use through either through UI or through code, and the expressive power you get versus the difficulty of implementing them. So at the bottom of this graph is just using Dynamo itself, using the UI, adding nodes to the canvas through out of the box. And then a little bit higher than that, you've got custom nodes kind of overlapping with design script or code blocks. So that's things you can also use through the UI, but you can build up more complex complex graphs and complex functionality that way without really leaving the application. And then there's another step up in difficulty and expressiveness with zero touch. And then after that, if any of you are familiar with kind of like UI nodes or node model nodes, you know that they are a big ramp up in difficulty, require some like computer science concepts that are not it's common in computer science, not a very common kind of set of knowledge in our AEC. And so just even explaining that concept or teaching it to your coworkers is pretty difficult. And even for people on the Dynamo team to implement some of those nodes is kind of tricky. So And then one step above that, there's host integration, which is something like Dynamo Revit or Dynamo for Maya or Dynamo for Rhino, or whatever it might be. Something one level above that even, where you're actually calling these core APIs.
Is it, sorry to interrupt, is it normal for the UI to be that complex, or is it just the implementation of Dynamo is complex?
We can talk specifically about that probably in more detail definitely later, but one of the reasons it's hard in Dynamo is because, like Luke was saying yesterday, we have design script, and the whole graph compiles down to that. And essentially, when you are writing a UI node, you have to know how your UI binds to the AST. And we could probably do a better job of like auto binding somehow through zero touch nodes or through some kind of zero touch like thing. But the way that it's implemented right now is you have to know that you're really generating an AST. You have to know what that node becomes when it gets compiled into design script. So you have to know WPF if you're going to write a UI node, and then you need to know the design script AST builder at the same time. So it's difficult. It's difficult for us. It's difficult for you. Yeah. So I think a lot of the things that people want to do with UI nodes might be able to be done with extensions, and that's interesting because you don't need to know about ASTs or the design script syntax. So extensions are somewhere, I think, between zero touch. They have a lot of expressive power, and they don't require knowing about some of these. Depending on what you're doing, you may not need to know about the AST or kind of the design script virtual machine, hopefully. And so you can just use WPF, C# stuff. So trying to think about when to use an extension, when would you want to use an extension, as opposed to these other kind of extensibility mechanisms. So when you want control over the graph itself, like when you want to add or remove nodes or notes or do some like meta programming, essentially, right? You want to generate a program. You want your extension to generate a Dynamo program or design script program. The way that, one of the reasons that zero-touch nodes were designed so that they don't have access to the rest of the graph is because it would be, as a design decision, it would be odd if a node in a piece of code in your graph just started, removing other nodes. If that was like a privileged node. I mean, there's another reason, which is we want to be able to have, we wanted to make the C# as simple to import as possible, like the whole zero-touch concept. Try to sprinkle in as few Dynamo-centric APIs as possible and still have the C# import and turn into zero-touch nodes. So when you want control over the graph, an extension kind of signals that. So if someone installs an extension, it might be more obvious, like this thing has more power than just a package, potentially, or just a package with zero-touch nodes in it, or custom nodes, or Python nodes or something. If you want to add UI or functionality that's external to a single node, which is kind of the same idea, but if you want some UI that doesn't just live on the node itself in the graph, but maybe a separate window, a separate viewer, something like that. So another good one is core functionality that needs improvement for us. So we started when we first added the extensions framework to Dynamo to factor out some stuff. So actually the package manager is an extension. Not the view portion of it, that still hasn't been pulled out and made into like a view extension, but the model layer of the package manager is an extension that gets loaded through the extensions framework. There's also the new library UI is an extension, is a view extension. So it's not part of the core. It gets loaded as a separate piece and added. The same with, there's a couple other small pieces of UI functionality that were added that way. And so if someone wanted to do a pull request to Dynamo but didn't want to modify the Dynamo core, didn't want to mess with having to know about all this other, all the other functionality in there and worry about breaking things there, one way to do it, and one way that we're going to try to add functionality going forward, is using extensions. That's, maybe that would open up more contributions from external parties, which is something we're really interested in. And like I was saying before, maybe you don't feel like learning about abstract syntax trees today. It's just not the day. that you want to get into that. So what can we do with them? So you can create an instance of your extension when Dynamo starts. This is kind of like you get some callbacks that let you know that the extension that Dynamo started or Dynamo's finished loading, or what, some life cycle events that we'll go over. And then you could add menu items to the Dynamo window pretty simply. So you can add your own menu item inside of the view, or settings menu item that would open up if you had a command you wanted to run or a window you wanted to open up. You can get a reference to the current workspace, which is something that I think we get requests for from zero-touch nodes a lot, which is I want to be able to access the current workspace and get some information, like where is the file path to this thing, or can I get an event when a node gets added, or something like that, or a connector gets added, or some modification happens. So if you have a reference to this current workspace, you can do a lot. The API for that object has a lot of functionality on it. You can also execute model commands on the Dynamo model. So I'll go into some examples of this, but this is essentially how the UI interaction in Dynamo is done. So there's these commands that you can run, that you can execute against the model or against the view model layers of Dynamo, and do things like add a node, and then it will. You won't just add a node; you'll also add some state to the undo redo recorder. So this is you can do kind of pre-baked functionality that we let people do through the UI, and you can execute that functionality from your extension. So if there's something that Dynamo can do, and you want to take advantage of that, there's probably a command that you can find which will do it. So for instance, like zooming to a specific node, that's like something we have a command for, or saving as and opening the dialog box if the file is not saved. So there's these different levels of commands and parameters you can pass to them. You could get a reference to the Dynamo view, which is like the whole window, and then you have as much control as Dynamo Sandbox or Dynamo Revit or something. So you essentially have like application level control, and that's good and bad from like a permissions point of view. So that's kind of coming back to the responsibility aspect of like what you end up doing with how much you end up affecting some users' experience using Dynamo. And I can show you how to kind of get into that. So the architecture, just from like from building an extension, is just there's two parts. So one is a .NET assembly that contains a class which implements these two, either one of these two interfaces, either an iView extension or an iExtension. And then there's some methods that you'll implement as part of those interfaces, and they're pretty simple. I believe they both have a dispose method, a startup method, loaded, shutdown, some unique ID, and this sample is a little bit funny that it returns a different unique ID. Probably you would want to return a static ID because you may not want to. I think our system doesn't want to load two of the same extensions at this point. So it depends how you set this up. You could set it up so that someone could actually load two of your extensions at the same time, two instances of your extension, but that has to do with how you set up the unique ID. If you make a new random GUID like this each time, then you could potentially like load many of these extensions if there's a reason that you wanted to do that. And then some name, which will show up in the log, so users would know that this extension got loaded at this time and got unloaded at this other time. It'll show up in the console. And the other part is kind of like, if you're familiar with Revit add-ins, very similar. There's like a manifest, which is just an XML file, which has some either a view extension definition element or an extension definition element. So there's, it's pretty simple in here. Either this is view extension definition or extension definition, some assembly path that points to where the DLL actually lives. and this, where it lives is, is wherever you end up putting it, because right now you'd kind of have to manually install the extension, which is something that we're working on, or write an installer or move it somewhere. And then the type name element, which is what namespace and class Dynamo is going to create. So it's going to create an instance of that extension. So this is the notifications extension that's in Dynamo, just a tiny little bit of UI around displaying notifications, and this is the just taken from the Dynamo source. So it points to that. It points back to the Dynamo Dynamo main installation folder, which is just so it's a relative path to that DLL, and then it tells Dynamo to instantiate the Dynamo notifications view extension when this extension gets loaded. So inside of the Dynamo folder, there's these two subfolders, extensions or view extensions, and the naming of this manifest file is important. So it's whatever your extension name is, underscore extension definition.xml or view extension definition.xml. So this is actually, I think, I left off the definition bit. So even though naming is important, this is wrong. Pretty sure it's extension definition, capital D. And you can look, if you look in the Dynamo folder, you'll see the extensions that we already load, and you can just follow the naming convention there. So it will, if it finds, at Dynamo's startup, it'll look in these two folders, and if it finds any extension definition XMLs, it'll then go and just instantiate those types. So before I get into this, I'm curious, just does anyone have any experience with MVVM kind of patterns or what that stuff means? So, model, view model architecture is a pretty common pattern when using WPF, Windows Presentation Foundation, to build UI in .NET. And we've kind of followed that. I mean, we have a have a pretty complicated code base at this point, but that's the kind of pattern we've tried to follow. And so there's if anyone's looked at the Dynamo repo, which I hope some of you have built at this point and have working, that's not totally necessary. But if we're going to use the Dynamo samples repo to get started, and just want to make sure that we're aligned between the version of the samples repo and the version of Dynamo that we're running. So you could run against Dynamo, installed version of Dynamo or something. You can add your extension there, but I just want to make sure we're using the same version of the samples and the same version of Dynamo. But anyway, if you've looked at that repo, there's this Dynamo core project, which essentially is like all the core APIs. There's libraries, which is our nodes mostly. And then there's Dynamo Core WPF, which is the UI, the WPF UI. So there's a big split, and we try to maintain this split between the model layer and the WPF layer. So nothing in the Dynamo Core has any dependencies on WPF. So it'll build on Mac or Linux or whatever through Mono, which is important. So you can deploy Dynamo potentially on Mac without a UI. And that's because this effort was made to keep these WPF references out. And that's it's important to note because you could also do the same thing with your extension, right? So if somehow you end up deploying Dynamo on Mac or Linux or something, or we end up deploying it on Mac or Linux at some point, and you want your extension to work, you may want to not write a view extension. You might want to just write a regular extension that has no references to WPF, and then that could be deployed and run without a UI if you were writing an extension that was useful that way. So the extensions architecture, that's why there's extensions and view extensions, and they're split in that way. So the kind of just this is just an overview of Dynamo, not really thinking about the extensions bit yet, but the top part in blue is our kind of Dynamo WPF UI, which is inside of the Dynamo Core WPF DLL, and that essentially communicates with the model via these recordable commands. Then there's some graph representation, which is that workspace model, which you can get a reference to through extensions. And there's and that holds node models and connector models. And then once we get past this point, these other boxes here are essentially the design script virtual machine and a way for the design script virtual machine to import foreign code, this FFI, which is a foreign function interface. But this is not as important to know. It's just the model layer has all of these bits in it so that it can run without the UI. And one thing that you get out of this kind of architecture is you could write a totally different UI for Dynamo and still have the underlying model stay the same. So you could have multiple UIs run at the same time. So you could essentially write an extension that looks at the model and is a totally different graph editor, or a totally different view of that same data, and you could run them at the same time. You could have like 5 view extensions that all are showing different representations of the model. Okay, so that's kind of just an overview for this next slide, which is where these lifecycle events get called. So there's 2 important ones. There's also shutdown, but the kind of 2 important ones for just getting started and getting something up and running are startup and loaded. And so at startup, Dynamo is going to call these 2 methods, and either the Dynamo model or the Dynamo view is going to call the methods, depending if it's a extension or a view extension. So Dynamo model starts up, extensions get instantiated, and then startup gets called on those extensions. So this is that Dynamo model has just started. It may not be ready for interaction yet. The user might not be able to do anything, but the model is built. And then loaded will get called. And there's interesting parameters that get passed to both of these things, which I'll go into. But this is just the life cycle. And then after that, the view extensions get instantiated. Startup gets called on them. Loaded gets called on them when it's ready for interaction. So when loaded gets called on the view extensions, that's like Dynamo model's ready, Dynamo view is ready, the user can actually do things now. And then at some point in the future, shutdown is going to get called on the view, and then shutdown will get called on the model extensions, like if someone unloads an extension somehow, which they can't do right now, but it's possible that in the future we would have some way for them to unload an extension at runtime, so those will get called, or if Dynamo's shutting down, these will get called. So important takeaway, startup, then loaded. Okay, so this just kind of goes back to what I was saying before. I was talking with Peter, who's the developer who kind of pushed for extensions, built the extensions framework, and started pulling stuff out of Dynamo and putting them into the extensions manager. And one important point that he had was that view extensions they have reference to the extensions manager, actually. And the reason for that is so that you can build extensions which reference you can build view extensions which reference other model layer extensions. So you could potentially build view extensions. You can build a model extension which builds some kind of data, and then you can build views for that, which you compose. So an interesting possibility is to build multiple view extensions which reference one piece, one set of data, and then let you build multiple views of that. Which is kind of going back. You could do the same thing with the Dynamo model, just taking advantage of MVVM for that, and the separation between WPF and the core. So this is looking more at like what is actually in these startup and loaded params, and these are the kind of like what can you do with the APIs in Dynamo, because besides being like a workshop on extensions, this is to do anything with the extensions that's interesting besides just like loading another application that sits there and does nothing with Dynamo. You kind of need to know about the Dynamo core APIs. And like I'm calling them APIs, but really this is probably the first time we've ever talked to anybody about using Dynamo models APIs to do anything interesting. So it will be like, I'm going to go over what these do, and it's really interesting to see like when you try to build things, what's missing. And I think that will be like really good for our team. So that I don't think we've ever like had a slide with these things on them that's like externally facing before. So it's about extensions, but it's really about the APIs that we've got and what can you do with them as an external user, because that's different than like what we can do internally, and we know about them, and we also do some magic stuff to get around some of the things we put in place. So, but just to go through some of these at a high level. Let's see. So ready params and startup params are like the top two sets of boxes are the model layer. So this is what you get as a these are like what you get as a model extension. So you would get access to at startup you would get access to the auth provider, which is essentially like if you're in Revit and you log in through Revit, you can tell that you're logged in. So, for instance, like if you're using Package Manager and you start up Dynamo Sandbox, you can't upload anything because Dynamo Sandbox doesn't have an auth provider. So if for some reason you need to know that the user's logged in to some kind of Autodesk service, you can use this auth provider. I'm not sure what exactly you would use that for, but you could use it as some kind of login access control mechanism that kind of relies on our ability to log in. Preferences is like all the Dynamo preference settings. You can read those and access those. Path Manager, you can get to really interesting kind of locations that are loaded at Dynamo Startup. So this is things like what's a nodes directory, where all the DLL's UI nodes live. What's the package path directory, so you can find all the other packages and potentially do something horrible with that. So just like you have a lot of access. The library loader is pretty interesting. So you can load other libraries at runtime. So you could start up and you can import another DLL as a zero-touch package from your extension. You can import design script files. I think the library loader, you can look at like all the loaded functions that are currently loaded into the VM, things like that. Custom node manager, you have access to like all the loaded custom nodes. You could create custom nodes at runtime. You could like build a custom node at runtime in memory and then like inject it. So if you wanted to like construct and then have it show up in the library. And the Dynamo version is just string Dynamo version of the engine number. And then like the view extension only adds one thing at this point, which is the extensions manager. So from a view extension at startup, you can get to all the other extensions. So you could do that composition. Or you could do other things like load other extensions potentially. And then the ready param, so these ones on the left, actually, these are the ones that get called second, like when interaction is ready. So here you have access to like all the workspace models that are currently loaded and the current workspace model. So you can get access to the workspace model that the user is currently looking at. And this is probably the starting point of, I think, of a lot of work. And the API for workspace model is kind of crazy. It's probably too big. There's probably too many public methods on it. But maybe we're totally missing something. So it'd be pretty interesting to see like what you guys want to do with that. The command executive is an object which lets you run these commands that I talked about before, and I've got some actual API samples of that we can look at. Notification received is just an event that will trigger when a notification from the notifications manager gets thrown. Not as interesting. Current workspace changed event is like the user has switched workspaces. And then I'm going to really quickly go through these, but these are pretty interesting and pretty powerful. In a view extension, when the view extension gets totally loaded, you've got access to the Dynamo menu, so you can add a new menu item, so people can actually access your extension, or pop up a window or run some command or something. You also have access to the background preview, so that's the geometry viewer. So you could inject your own geometry views into that viewer. You could totally replace it with another control. You can do pretty interesting things to the background visualization. there. You could change the colors. You can do a lot. You can potentially like totally change that experience. Render package factory is like an object which lets you inject geometry into the background. It like helps do that. The Dynamo window is the Dynamo view. So I have a star next to it because there's some hacky stuff you can do to get access to everything here, and just be in control of the application at that point. But remember the responsibility bit. And then there's a view command executive, so you can run like view commands. Add menu item is just like a helper function, so you can inject menu items. And the selection collection changed is an interaction event, so that you can tell when someone has changed a selection in Dynamo. All pretty useful stuff, and some of these are kind of wrappers around things that we have that you'll be able to find if you dive in through some of these other objects, but they're just things that we've figured immediately are going to come up in kind of extension development. But I bet there's stuff that's missing here as well, and I would be really interested in feedback on APIs here if you think they're too big, if you're missing stuff that you want to do. So with all the stuff that I showed, you can make a lot happen. One thing that's not obvious is that the view loaded params.dynamo window, which is back here, this guy, it's data context. So if you're familiar with WPF, the data context is essentially like what this view gets bound to. And in MVVM, that's usually a view model. And here it is a view model. It's the Dynamo view model. And so from the Dynamo view model, you can do a ton of things. And we don't expose the Dynamo view model. It wasn't part of that API, like that top level API. And so I would say if you have to do this, you're doing something more complicated, and it might change in the future. I mean, our extensions do this. Like the library does this, and then gets access to the Dynamo view model, and is able to have high levels of control because we needed it for that extension. But maybe it's not the right starting point. But from here, if you look at the API for the Dynamo view model, there's a ton of things you can do. You can get access to all parts of the application pretty much. So I'm just going to kind of go through the steps for building the Dynamo samples repo, and kind of go through what one of the sample extensions does. And hopefully, either you guys have got the code already loaded or pulled down from GitHub at that link. If not, now might be a good time to go through that. And I can throw this link in the Slack later if anybody needs it. But you can just go to Dynamo DS on GitHub, and then check out the Dynamo samples repo. And then I would also recommend, if you don't have Dynamo itself pulled down, that would be good to pull down and build, unless you've got it installed and you're sure that you're already on 2.0. Because otherwise you'll have a mismatch between the samples that you're building and the version of Dynamo. Did anyone have any trouble building either of those, or didn't have time to do it? A little bit.
So the samples last night, the Dynamo samples repo, it wouldn't build because it couldn't resolve the NuGet reference to the beta NuGet tag. I don't know why. So I had to use the 1.3.
Okay. Interesting.
Package. I don't know if it was meant to do that or not, but
well, it was. I know it was updated, but potentially somebody
pulled it off.
That would be hard to do on NuGet though.
I don't know. I switched to 1.3
and it worked. Yeah. So I mean, if someone has trouble building the master branch of Dynamo samples repo, then like Radu said, you might want to pull the 1.3 branch, but then you'd also need to be running 1.3 Dynamo. So just keep that in mind. They have to match whichever versions. What's up? Yeah. So just just why that is maybe. So the Dynamo samples repo has a bunch of references to NuGets that we upload of Dynamo core. So you shouldn't need Dynamo to build that repo. But apparently, Radu, you were saying the NuGet somehow disappeared.
Well, it just can't find the one that was referenced in there. It was referenced in 2.0 beta 3907, and I can't find the NuGet for that.
So we can come around and check that out. Maybe there's something. Maybe I can just like upload that or something like that, or we can upload, or I can change the repo really quick. Send a PR to Jose Hill Merchant. But this is the view extension sample that's in there. So I mean, if you can't get it building now, or if there's some problem with the repo building, we can fix that. But I'm just going to go through kind of what the code in this repo for this sample specifically does. And this thing is at dynamo.ds/dynamo samples. And if you pull master, you're going to get the Dynamo 2.0 version of this. And if you pull, there's a 1.3 branch if you're running Dynamo 1.3, which will, those extensions that you build will be able to be imported into Dynamo 1.3. So the extension that gets built in here is pretty simple. It opens up another window and it tracks the current nodes that are in the graph. And then updates the list of them when they get added or removed. So creating a sample WPF extension involves a couple steps, which is creating a new Visual Studio project, reference some Dynamo NuGets, implement an iView extension, add a menu item that lets you actually interact with that thing, and then load it into Dynamo and move the files where they need to be to actually get imported. Simple. So this is kind of the diagram of what the sample does, what this extension does. So there's Dynamo, there's a current workspace model, and then there's our view extension. The view extension has a reference to the window, and the window has a reference to this view model, and we build a reference between the view model and the current workspace model that is the nodes. So we're interested in what the active nodes are, and we'll build a binding with WPF, which will kind of data bind between this view model we're going to build, which is hooked up to the current workspace model's nodes, and then when that changes, we'll get some, WPF will see this data binding has changed, and then text will update in this window, which will show the names of these nodes. Right. So the current workspace model, the diagram here almost looks like the image here. Right. There's the current workspace model on the left, the window and the view model of our extension on the right, and then there's some binding between them. We change the data in the workspace and we get an updated view on the right. And this is just a simple thing. We're seeing like text here, but it could be like a complex view of the same data. You could build a tree view or some kind of textual view of the graph. So if you didn't want to pull Dynamo samples, let's say, and you wanted to build a completely new repo, or it's not building for some reason because I messed up the NuGets, then, but if you, or you want to start a brand new extension, then you want to start a Visual Studio class library project, and you want to target .NET 4.5, most likely, definitely minimum. I don't think I've tested it with like 4.6 or 4.5.2. I'm pretty sure our samples are 4.5, so I would just recommend going with that unless you want to mess around and test the limits. And then you want to reference Dynamo Core WPF UI NuGet. And probably if you want to build on Dynamo 2, one of our latest beta NuGets. So you can get into this NuGet search thing if you're not familiar with Visual Studio. If you right-click on your project, you can go to like Manage NuGet packages, and if someone's not familiar with that, I can come around and get that hooked up, or you can check out I think it's in Tools, NuGet Package Manager extension in Visual Studio is the place to start, and just search for Dynamo Core WPF UI and Dynamo Core. And I believe if you install Dynamo Core WPF UI 2. Whatever blah 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 latest pre-release build of Dynamo that's up there, it'll install Dynamo Core also. So I think you just have to target the WPF stuff. Yeah, so right-click project, manage NuGet packages, and then browse, and then search for Dynamo Visual Programming. And then first step is implementing a class, a public class. I believe it's got to be public, so we can create an instance of it easily. And then for this sample, we're going to implement iView extension. So if it's an iView extension, it can get loaded as a view extension. And you need these, this dispose method, which is where you could unhook your kind of like view logic. So for instance, like if the view, if you had 2 view extensions, and we give users the ability to unload extensions at runtime, you'd want to implement dispose and disconnect your like event handlers here or whatever unmanaged, not .NET resources you're opening up. So like if it's like a file handle or something that you need to dispose when this extension disappears, you should probably do it in the dispose method. And then you have startup. We're not going to do anything with startup here. We're just going to look at the loaded method, which if you recall, loaded happens when, in a view extension, loaded happens when the view is totally loaded. So this is like the view is there, the user's cursors on the screen, and the canvas is like rendered. So the things we're going to do here, which I'll show on the next slide, but to get an overview, because it'll be like a big jump in code, is just add a menu item that lets users open a new window, and then when that menu item gets clicked, open the window, and then also create a model, some data representation that we want to bind to for the extension, and then the window that we opened up will display that data in some way. So there's a couple steps happening in that chunk of code. So we are going to build another class, which is this sample window view model, and this is just the data, like the view model that's going to represent the data we're showing in that, and it's going to be a notification object, and it's going to implement iDisposable. So I believe notification object is going to have some methods on it that you can raise property changes for WPF so that you can do binding. So that is more of a WPF thing, but we can, depending on people's familiarity with that, we can get into that. We can talk more about WPF and how much of a joy it is to work with. So one thing we do here is save a reference to these ready params. So this is the kind of these are essentially the loaded parameters that we talked about before, like all those properties that you could get when a view starts up, when a view extension starts up. So in the constructor for this thing, we save a reference to that because we're going to want it later. And then we have this other method, current workspace model nodes changed, and then we call this raise property changed with nothing in it. So that'll just raise all property changes. So we're not doing much in here yet. We're just essentially saving the parameters in this thing. And you can see that the constructor for this thing takes that whole big parameter. And then filling this out a little bit more. So now we have up on top a public string. So this is actually what we're going to display in the UI. So we have this public string, active node types, and it's a property. Because I think you can only do binding in WPF to properties. So it's not a field of the class. It's a public property with a getter, and it when it runs, it does this function get node types, which basically just builds a big string of all the node names in the graph. And so you can see that we are iterating over the ready parameters dot current workspace model dot nodes. So this lets you access the current workspace model the users got open, and the nodes that are in that current graph. And then we're just taking the node name. And you'll also probably, once you start looking at the APIs for node model here, realize there's a lot of stuff on node model. And we can talk about, what those APIs do. But there's a ton of useful stuff you can do to each individual node. But this essentially just builds a big string of all the node names. And then that's what gets returned from the active node types. And we added a little bit more to the constructor here for this view model. So it takes the parameters that get passed from the extension. So this is saving like access to all those different extension parameters. And then we hook up two events which trigger our change event. So whenever we look again at the current workspace model from the ready params, and now we're looking at the node added and node removed events. So whenever a node gets removed or added from the model, we get this update event, and then we go and we change this string of all the node names, right? So whenever the nodes in the graph change, we calculate a new string of all their names and concatenate them all together. And then at the very end, we have a dispose where we unhook these events. So this is kind of the really simple view of like what we're doing here. Again, is we've got this window, this extension window we're going to open up for our extension. It's going to be bound to this view model that we're building, this sample window view model thing. It only has one data binding, which is active node types property, which is a public property on that view model. And then whenever the nodes recalculate in the graph, or whenever this event gets triggered, nodes added or removed, we do two things. We recalculate the nodes in the graph and generate this string, and then we raise a property change for active node types. And that property change actually triggers the UI to update, and that's kind of a WPF thing. Okay, and then we build some actual UI, really simple, control that. Yeah, and looking at XAML is always fun. But a control that essentially just has a text block in it and draws the string that we had. So it's all the names of the nodes in a grid with a text block in there. So you can add a new WPF user control to the project, and you want to use a WPF control, and then we're going to bind this text in this text block using active node types. And this means that the data context for this, I believe the data context for this control is going to be that sample view extension. So we'll set that in the extension. So this is just a binding to that property on the view model. And if this is all totally foreign to you, we can totally, let's talk more one-on-one about WPF, and I'm sure we can send some help people's way to get more familiar with this stuff. But essentially, this is it. I mean, I figure most of you are at least a little bit familiar with WPF, but this is like XAML is like a markup language for drawing controls. It's kind of, you could think about it kind of like a it's not like HTML really, but there's elements here, and you're building, you can fill in properties like this of those objects, like setting, essentially this is, going in the back, this is calling a constructor for this text block object and then setting a bunch of parameters on it and building a binding between the text property of this text block and the active nodes property of or active node type, sorry, of our view model. So when one updates and we raise the property change, the UI will update and show that text. And then actually, so this is like the top level. This is back all the way up in our extension now, in the loaded method. So now that we've implemented the data and the UI, we need to actually instantiate this stuff. So at the very top in the loaded example, we have this, we build a new menu item with just this is another WPF control. Give it some header, which will be the text that shows up, and it could be more complicated than that. You could put icons in it or images and stuff like that. But here it's just some text, and then on click we have some function that runs, and the function instantiates this sample window view model, which is the view model that we have been building, and then use the send in the parameters. So these are the loaded parameters that the extension gives us from up here. Instantiate our new control, which is the sample window, and then set the data context to the view model that we just built. So we built the view model, set the data context so that that active node types property means something, and then we also set the owner of the window to the Dynamo window. So this is useful for, like, if you close the window, you want both to close. I think if you minimize it, maybe it will minimize that other window as well if the owner is set correctly, things like that. And then here, just manually setting the position of the window and moving it relative to the owner's position when it opens up. And then finally show it. And then the last thing that we do is we call this add menu item like utility function, which is also passed down in the view loaded params. And there's this one's pretty simple. This API lets you pick one of the Dynamo views or the Dynamo menus that already exist. You can add your menu item to an existing menu, and then you just tell it what menu you want to add it to, and then also the menu item that you want to add. You can also do things like add separators, like if you want your menu item to show up in a totally sub menu or something, you have that control. And then the last two steps are to now go and add some XML file to the project. So you can do that through Visual Studio, and then you want to add something that looks similar to this, just depending on where you're going to place your final DLLs, and depending on what the namespace and class name was for your type. So the assembly name is pointing to this sample view extension, and the type name is, I think here we had the same namespace as the name of the class, so it's sample view extension, and then this outer element depends on if it's a extension or view extension also. So this should be view extension definition or just extension definition, depending on what type you're building. And then you want to copy those to wherever Dynamo is. If it's a local build that you're building, or if it's an installed version of Dynamo, you would copy those into, this is like if you're building from source from Dynamo, you'd put it in debug or release wherever it's building. Inside of view extensions, you'd put that view extension definition XML file, and then you'd put your sample view extension.dll, the actual DLL for that thing, just under debug. And that could be changed depending on what you put here in the relative path pointing to the assembly path. So that should be straightforward. It's just when it loads, where does it go to load the DLL, and when it goes and finds that DLL, what does it try to instantiate inside that DLL is basically what's in this file. And then this thing should show up. You should get something added to the bottom of the view menu, which is where we put the menu item. And then this thing should show up kind of offset from the center of this window. And then I've just got some kind of smaller API samples around kind of just like one-off little things that I think are not obvious parts of our API, which might be useful. And I can totally share this. I'll post this link to this presentation on the Slack, so you guys can check it out or copy things out of here. Because I know none of all that stuff not going to be. It's pretty hard to just like remember. So, but the things that I think are useful to check out is this, or maybe not, things that are not obvious from looking at the API on the extensions level, is the command executive .execute command. You have to pass it a command, but what is that, and where do those live? So you can build them by using on the Dynamo model, I believe they're static. I think they're static object or static constructors, I believe, on the Dynamo model that you can just build. So for instance, this command the force run cancel command, appropriately named, is lets you run the graph or cancel it. So this can be used for either of those. And there's some properties here that you pass. I believe one of them is, so these should be documented since they're public methods, but they, I think one of these lets you run or cancel, and the other one lets you suppress errors from the run, something like that. But so you can do things, like in the middle of your extension when somebody presses a button, or when you want, when somebody pressed next in a debugger or something, you run the graph again, or something like that, or run part of the graph. And then you also provide, when you execute a command, you provide your unique ID and your name, so that there's a log of what extension is executing that command. And then the place to look at this and see all of these commands is in the Dynamo source. You can look at Dynamo core models recordable commands.cs, and that, it would be better if we had some nice documentation around that. And there is like an auto-generated to Dynamo core API site, but I think it would probably just be useful to check out that file. And I don't have a link for the API auto-gen stuff, but Russell, we can put it on the Slack, right?
Yeah, it's on the wiki.
Okay.
On the Dynamo core wiki.
So that's kind of nice for this, because it might be useful for this session, because that's a searchable auto-generated thing. So it might be a little bit easier than like rummaging through the giant repo. So I'll get that link up. And then the other thing is that you can also run view model commands, which are accessed a little bit differently and have more powers. So these are things you want to do to the view, which aren't really exposed nicely through the extensions framework yet. So what you have to do is what I was showing before, where you get the Dynamo window and then you get the data context for that, which is going to be set as the Dynamo view model. And from there, you can either run things on the view model, or I think more interestingly, you can run things on the Workspace view model. You can execute commands on the Workspace, so you can make it do things like reset the view zoom level, or pan, or rotate the camera, things like that. Add things to selection, just any kind of UI interaction that we would have through the UI, you can also execute from the extension. And then there's one other thing I thought would be interesting to people, is just how would you go about with an extension doing something like injecting some UI into other parts of the application. So for instance, like how would you add some new text to every node, or add a button to existing nodes, so that you don't need to write a new UI node. So one feature request that we've had forever, and we've never had time to implement, is like, I want a button that will run this node, or I want a way to run from this spot, or I want to delete element binding on this node, or from any node. But we don't, I don't think that that's something we're going to do right now. But someone could, and also, we don't want to change the base UI of nodes to add this extra button, let's say, right? It's just not on our like roadmap at this point, whatever that feature is. But an extension has access to the view, so it could potentially like add lots of functionality. So this is just an example of how you could get access to the existing node views and inject some text. So here it's just injecting the real name of that exact node that's going to be run into the node, and not a final UX UI here, definitely. But you could imagine this is like a whole nother property that gets added to nodes that your extension adds, right? So we have like preview state of the node, like is it on, is it frozen, anything like that. But you could add other properties to the node. You could add a new menu item to the checkbox, or to the right-click menu of the selection on the node. So things like drop element binding data, or run from here, or something like that could be potentially added and injected into existing UI like this. So then how's that done? So note the warning, this is like a hack I was like writing last night. Definitely there's like a performance implication to this code, but there's going to be a nicer way to do this. And if there isn't, we should add one. So just beware, don't do exactly what I'm doing here. But the idea is that you can get access to these views and change them. So basically when the window gets re-rendered, so I'm looking at the loaded parameters, again, the view loaded parameters, looking at the Dynamo window, and then looking at layout updated, which is a WPF event that exists on all windows, I think, maybe even all framework elements. And then I have this method that runs, Dynamo window content rendered. And when it runs, we look at, another thing that's a little hacky. We look at the Dynamo window, and because WPF stores all the elements as a tree, we could actually just iterate the whole tree. So there's no real nice way to go just like get the node views from our system, probably because someone decided it would be bad to be able to do that. But you can look them up. So you can find all the visual children, all the framework elements that are node views of that type. Then once you have access to those, they all have this thing called an input grid, which is like the main grid where all the Dynamo extra kind of customized UI goes usually. So you can access that input grid, and then you can put stuff in there. So here we're just adding a text block with the text set to the creation name, which is like the real name of the node. So it won't change when a user changes the name of the node. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Maybe it's something that we should incorporate into the actual node UI. So maybe someone wants to, you want to still know the real name of the node, even when a user's changed like the user-facing name, the display name. And then you just add that to the input grid children. So that's just like an idea, and I'm sure there's a better way to do this, or should be. And if anyone wants to look at that code, it's at this link. It's in my fork of the Dynamo samples repo on this extensions workshop branch. And once I finish this up, I will drop this into Slack so you can use these links. Okay, and then I'm almost done. Last thing is kind of incoming changes. So these are things that we are working on right now, and some of you might have noticed some people are talking to me about this PR. So we're investigating. So stepping back a sec. So right now, you build this extension, you do all this work, you learn about all these APIs, you build something really cool, and then you have to tell users to go and add it to a folder in their Dynamo installation directory somewhere, and they have to name this XML file the right thing, and they have to put that in the right spot. And if you ever update your extension, and you have to give it to them again, and yada yada, or you have to write an installer, which is no fun. So we're investigating having the package manager load extensions, and be in charge of distribution of extensions as one way to do it. So that would mean that packages could contain multiple extensions. They could contain view extensions or model extensions. I don't know when this work will get in, or if it will, but it seems pretty interesting. The loading sequence might change a bit, so I just wanted to mention this because we just went over all this information, and I know some of it might be getting tweaked a little bit. So the loading sequence might change of those kind of lifecycle events. Probably not. Hopefully not. And there might be some more added. Another thing is loaded parameters will also likely contain a reference to the startup parameters, and that's because if some user loads a package later after Dynamo startup time, there will be no startup event because Dynamo's already started at that point. So we don't want users to miss, or extensions developers to miss those properties. Like things like the auth provider or the library loader. They're just stuff that it could be important, and that way you won't have like broken extensions that only work if they're loaded in a certain way. So the API might change a little bit, just adding stuff, not getting rid of anything there. But it would be really good to know now or soon, before the 2.0 release, if we do this package manager work for 2.0, what APIs are getting in the way for you or of something you're trying to build. What's missing, from these extension APIs, because then potentially we could make sure it works with the way the package manager could load it, and also maybe actually get it in for 2.0 potentially. No promises, but it would be very informative to know, since we're doing this push and we want to make these as useful as possible. And it would be pretty cool to see new functionality developed on top of the extensions framework that's distributed to people through the package manager, without having to write custom installers. And the last thing to say here is that because it's on the package manager, your extension could also be removed, right? If someone uninstalls the package at runtime, so you have to be thinking about what will happen if someone removes this extension. So that's why the dispose and shut down becomes important. Removes it, adds it back. Removes it, adds it back. It's important to think about memory and things like that there. And then last, I just had some kind of off-the-cuff project ideas. Everyone that applied had some cool ideas. I just thought I'd share a couple of my own, which is just tracking graph changes by watching the Workspace collection modified events, maybe tying those with the auth provider to know who is doing it. So you could potentially ask the auth provider who is logged in, and then use that and track who's making these changes to the graph, something like that. An extension that finds missing dependencies, finds what packages are in the graph and then reports those, and maybe ties that to embeds that in the file somehow, or generates a report of or maybe just pops it up on the screen, maybe goes and downloads it from the package manager for you, if you're missing some package that's currently in there. Write your own graph UI, so just improve upon what's there, or modify the node UI, or write a totally different UI, a textual UI. You can do things like continuously convert the whole graph to design script through node to code and then display it side by side, so you could get a live update of all the DS. An execution results view, some different way of this was kind of something that I think got asked at the user group last night. It was we display results in preview bubbles, but and in background preview, but what other ways could we display results of graph execution? There's probably all sorts of interesting visualizations that we could do that someone could hook up and generate, have multiple extensions that are showing different views of that data. Maybe you click on a node and you get a different representation of its preview bubble values. A mini map, inject UI into the base node view, that one I showed, and then just improve our SAD background preview is another one, rendering shadows, totally replace it, etc. And that's it. Now it is your turn. Thanks for listening to me ramble on for a while, and I hope that was useful. Hope you enjoyed it. The end. And we can also totally open to any questions that you guys have got now, or maybe or throughout the day.
I'll kick off with one with the change to the JSON file format. Are you guys going to change the preferences XML and maybe these manifests to JSON as well? It would make sense to me if they were.
It makes sense to me, but you got to talk to yourself, because I think we nixed that.
For too low, we are low on time, and for right now, they are going to remain XML. We could potentially change it in a dot release.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so maybe into
we could load. Yeah, in the future we could load both, because they're simple enough.
Yeah, and maybe in terms of APIs, just one idea I had whilst watching the presentation was work with WordPress quite a bit, and the way they handle subscribing to events and things is quite interesting. So, for example, if I make an extension and let's say Matteo makes an extension, our users both install it. There's no way to control which one gets loaded first. In WordPress, they handle that with a kind of integer as a priority, as in you say my thing is a priority 10, it gets loaded at 10. and then someone else can say, oh, it's a 90 priority, it gets loaded later on. So I don't know, maybe some kind of mechanism to say which one gets loaded first, otherwise there's no way to ensure that.
Do you mean when the extension gets loaded, or
Yeah.
when it gets its events called before other extensions?
Essentially that when Dynamo calls the startup methods on each of the extensions.
Yeah,
Because I
that-
presume it just collects them
Yeah.
in whatever
I
order
mean-
it collects them in.
yeah, it's just a .NET,
Yeah.
you know, whatever the event subscription mechanism is. So yeah, we could use one of the other patterns there instead to add priority if that. Do you think that what would be the use case? Do you think?
If you have a dependency on another one. So for example, if I write a model extension that does something, and then I have another model extension that relies
Depends
on
on
the
that one.
previous one being executed first, for example.
Yeah.
Probably not good design to do it that way, but
No, something we should. It's pretty interesting. Like things like that will come up maybe immediately. I'm not sure. But yeah, that's
or for
interesting.
example, I write an extension that wants to track what other extensions are installed.
Yep.
If mine executes first, it'll say nothing. If it executes last, it'll say, oh, by the way, these ones are running.
Interesting.
Because analytics is one of the kind of big ones. Questions I have? Yes, that's silence all around.
Yeah. Should we?
Should we whiteboard who wants to work on what maybe? On yeah? Alright, let's turn everything into whiteboards and I don't know, maybe we'll start writing topics about what you guys want to be working on and see if
Thanks. Was it
there's
good?
some natural clusters.